Well, a couple years after the drug war was announced, crack cocaine appeared on the scene. Quite conveniently, some sociologists have called it a godsend to the Republican administration that crack appeared at the time that it did. The Reagan administration, seized on the development with glee, actually hiring staff whose job it was to publicize inner city crack babies, crack dealers, the so-called crack whores, in an effort to boost public support for a war it had already declared. And their media campaign worked like a charm. Almost overnight, our television sets were saturated with images of black and brown, crack babies and crack dealers and, crack whores. And this was not, just happenstance that journalists began to cover this. This was the product of a deliberate campaign, media campaign launched by the Reagan administration to focus public attention on, the so-called crack epidemic. And once our television sets became saturated with these images, a wave of punitiveness swept over the United States. And Congress and state legislatures, began competing with each other to pass ever harsher laws against drugs and against those who were perceived to be criminals. And Democrats began competing with Republicans to prove they could be even tougher on them than their Republican counterparts. And it was Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton, who expanded the drug war far beyond what President Reagan and his administration ever even dreamed possible. The largest expansion of black imprisonment occurred during the Clinton administration, not the Reagan administration. And it was the Clinton administration in its effort to prove they could be even tougher than them and kind of wing back those so-called swing white voters, the Reagan Democrats, that led his administration to champion laws barring drug offenders from food stamps from the rest of their lives and barring them from public housing. Kind of this race to incarcerate was driven by an effort to appeal to those so-called white swing voters by proving who could be toughest on the dark-skinned pariahs. Now, still, I find that this myth persists, that the drug war is motivated by a desire to root out violent offenders or drug kingpins. But if you take a look at the way the drug war is designed, is structured, you see its aim has never been to root out violent offenders or drug kingpins. Federal funding flows to those state and local law enforcement agencies that boost dramatically the sheer volume, the sheer numbers of drug arrests. Through the Edward Byrne Memorial Grant Program, relaunched by the Reagan administration, federal funding flows, millions of dollars flow to those state and local law enforcement agencies that are willing to conduct stop and frisk operations, stopping and frisking, searching folks in their cars in this hunt for drugs, because law enforcement gets rewarded in cash for sheer numbers, the sheer numbers. It doesn't matter if they're violent offenders. In fact, they don't get rewarded in cash for arresting violent offenders or even bringing down the drug kingpins. It's a numbers game. And to make matters worse, drug forfeiture laws allow state and local law enforcement agencies to keep up to 80% of the cars, cash, homes seized from suspected drug offenders, giving law enforcement a direct pecuniary interest in the profitability of the drug market itself and the longevity of the drug war. And the results are predictable. People of color have been rounded up in mass for relatively minor, nonviolent drug offenses. In 2005, for example, 4 out of 5 drug arrests were for possession, only 1 out of 5 were for sales. Most people in state prison for drug offenses have no history of violence or significant selling activity. And in fact, in the 1990s, the Clinton era, the period of the most dramatic expansion of the drug war, nearly 80% of the increase in drug arrests were for marijuana possession. A drug less harmful than alcohol or tobacco, and at least, if not more prevalent, in middle-class white communities and on college campuses and in universities as it is in poor communities of color. But the drug war has been waged almost exclusively there, and in this way, a new racial undercaste has been created in an astonishingly short period of time. Millions of people of color have been branded as felons and denied the very rights supposedly won in the civil rights movement. And the U.S. Supreme Court, for its part, has mostly turned a blind eye to race discrimination in the criminal justice system. In a series of cases beginning with McCleskey versus Kemp and Armstrong versus the United States, the U.S. Supreme Court has closed the courthouse doors to claims of racial bias at every stage of the criminal justice process, from stops and searches, plea bargaining, and sentencing. It is now impossible even to state a claim of race discrimination in the criminal justice system in the absence of evidence of conscious, intentional bias. You know, the tantamount to an admission of racial bias, the very sort of evidence that, you know, is nearly impossible to come by today, you know, in the era of color blindness where nearly everyone knows better than to say, yes, Your Honor, the reason I stopped him was because he was black. You know, yes, Your Honor, the reason I didn't give him that plea deal, well, it was because he was black. Unless there is evidence of conscious, intentional bias tantamount to an admission, you can't even state a claim for race discrimination in the criminal justice system. You know, in this way, the criminal justice system has been immunized from challenge, immunized, you know, against claims for racial bias, much in the same way that the Supreme Court once rallied to the defense of Jim Crow and slavery in their day. Now, I want to turn for just a moment to a few of the parallels between mass incarceration and Jim Crow. You know, think about some of the rules and laws that apply to those branded felons today, and just ask yourself if they remind you of an earlier era. Well, the first, most obvious one is denial of right to vote. You know, 48 states and the District of Columbia deny prisoners the right to vote. And, you know, that's just accepted as normal in the United States. But, you know, in other Western democracies, it's not so normal. And, you know, there are other European democracies where voting drives occur in prison. The idea that you forfeit your citizenship and your voting rights at the prison gates, then you're no longer considered one of us, that your opinion no longer matters. You know, not the case in some other European democracies that take the idea of democracy a little more seriously than we do in the United States. But here, you know, prisoners are denied the right to vote, but that's just the tip of the iceberg, because once you're released from prison, you could be denied the right to vote for a period of years or for the rest of your life. In a few states, 1 in 4 black men are disenfranchised, and nationwide, nearly 1 in 8 black men are either temporarily or permanently disenfranchised as a result of felon disenfranchisement laws. Then there's exclusion from jury service. You know, one hallmark of the Jim Crow system was the systematic exclusion of blacks from juries. Well, today, those labeled felons are deemed ineligible for jury service for the rest of their lives. And to make matters worse, if you've ever had a quote-unquote negative experience with law enforcement, you could be struck for cause from a jury on the grounds that you're not likely to be fair and impartial in a criminal case. You know, now good luck finding many African Americans in poor communities of color who have not yet had a negative experience with law enforcement that might justify their exclusion cause from a jury. So in many areas of the country, including areas that are fairly racially diverse, all white juries have been having a roaring comeback in the United States because such a large percentage of the African American community is either behind bars, labeled felons, or have a negative experience with law enforcement that allows their wholesale exclusion from jury service.